There is a version of World War I that most people carry with them. It lives in sepia photographs, in the measured cadences of memorials, in the idea of young men going bravely into something terrible, but somehow noble. It is a war of poppies and silence. A war that is remembered in the way a country keeps a wound, covered, dignified, not fully examined. That version exists because it had to. Because the alternative, the true account of what the war actually did to the men inside it, was so methodically destructive, so quietly institutional in its cruelty, that no government, no general, no poet laureate could afford to let it be the dominant story. So it was managed. The photographs were selected, the medical reports were classified, the letters were censored. The men who came back and could not stop shaking were told to be quiet about it. And the men who did not come back were numbered, filed, and replaced. What actually happened in the trenches of the Western Front between 1914 and 1918 was something that the industrial world had never produced before and has never quite managed to look at directly since. It was not a war in the traditional sense, not a contest of maneuver and strategy and decisive battle. It was a grinding, administrative erasure of human beings conducted with the organizational precision of a factory. The trenches were not a temporary condition. They became permanent. They became home. And inside that home, over 4 years, soldiers developed habits, routines, coping mechanisms and behaviors that would have been considered signs of madness in any previous era of human history. By 1916, those same behaviors had become so universal, so expected, so thoroughly normalized that the army built them into its operational planning. The psychological disintegration of the individual soldier was not an unfortunate side effect. It was a resource to be managed. This is an account of 24 of those habits, not heroic acts, not stories of courage under fire, though courage existed in abundance. These are the routines of men living inside a machine that had decided their lives were a consumable material, and how those men adapted to that reality in ways that the official histories have consistently understated, obscured, or simply omitted. Some of these habits were physical, some were psychological, some existed in the border territory between the two, in the place where the body and the mind negotiate with circumstances that neither was designed to endure. All of them became ordinary. That is the point. The extraordinary became ordinary, and then the ordinary became invisible. The first thing to understand about trench life is the mud. This sounds almost too simple to mention, as if saying the Western Front was wet is merely a statement of geography. But the mud of Flanders and the Somme and Passchendaele was not the mud of inconvenience. It was a living, consuming substance that the war created and sustained. The constant shelling broke the clay substrate of the Belgian and French lowlands into a fine particulate that mixed with the constant rainfall and the groundwater that had nowhere to drain, because every drainage channel had been destroyed by the same shelling that destroyed everything else. The result was a substance with the consistency and behavior of quicksand in places, of cold cement in others, and of a gray biological soup in the areas where bodies had been decomposing into it for months or years. Men fell into shell holes filled with this mixture and could not get out. They drowned in it. They disappeared into it. And the men who did not disappear learned to live in contact with it every waking hour. Cleaning became a ritual that had nothing to do with cleanliness. Soldiers would spend hours each day attempting to remove mud from their rifles, from their clothing, from their skin, knowing with complete certainty that within minutes of stepping outside the dugout, the mud would return. This ritual was not futile in the way that the soldiers understood it. The cleaning of the rifle was not about keeping the rifle clean. It was about having something to do with the hands. It was about maintaining the fiction that control was possible. The army enforced it anyway, and men were punished for rifles that jammed in combat due to mud, even when the rifle had been cleaned that same morning, even when the mud had accumulated in the 30 seconds between the trench line and the objective. The ritual of cleaning served the institution. The institution needed men who believed in the efficacy of ritual. So the cleaning continued every day in every sector for 4 years, and the mud returned every time and nothing changed, and the men cleaned their rifles again the next morning. Alongside the physical routine of maintenance came the adaptation to permanent cold and wet. The body's response to sustained cold exposure is well documented in retrospect, though it was poorly understood at the time. What the medical officers called rheumatism and what the soldiers called nothing, because they had stopped thinking of it as unusual, was the systematic destruction of peripheral circulation in the feet, hands, and lower legs. Trench foot was the official name for the most acute version of this condition. It began as numbness and swelling. It progressed to blistering and skin breakdown. In severe cases, it ended in gangrene and amputation. The army issued a prevention protocol. Soldiers were instructed to rub whale oil into their feet twice daily and to change their socks regularly. The protocol assumed that dry socks were available, which in the forward trenches they frequently were not. It assumed that whale oil had been distributed, which it frequently had not. It assumed that a man who had been standing in water for 48 hours of continuous duty had the energy and the opportunity to sit down and attend to his feet, which he frequently did not. Trench foot became routine. The medical evacuation system processed it as a standard diagnosis. Men were pulled from the line, treated, returned. Some men deliberately exacerbated their condition to extend their time at the aid station. This was not cowardice in any meaningful sense. It was rational calculation by men who understood that the aid station was less likely to kill them than the trench. The army knew it happened. They court-martialed some men for it. The court-martials had limited deterrent effect because the calculus did not change. The trench was more dangerous than the punishment. So men wet their feet on purpose, and the doctors knew it, and the paperwork was filed, and the next man came in. The rats came next in the order of things that became normalized. The Western Front rat population was one of the largest concentrations of the species ever assembled in a single geographic area. They fed on the dead. There were always dead available. In the areas between the opposing trench lines, in the spaces that became known by various names in various national armies but which shared the quality of being zones of absolute human absence during daylight hours, bodies lay unrecovered for days, weeks, and in some sectors months. The rats grew large on this abundance. Soldiers reported rats the size of cats, rats that moved without fear, rats that would bite sleeping men, rats that could be heard at night consuming the bodies of men who had fallen that afternoon. The adaptation to the rats went through several stages. Initially, men hunted them with bayonets and entrenching tools. There were informal competitions, rat-killing counts kept in dugouts the way a hunter keeps a tally. This phase passed. The killing was too exhausting and too ultimately pointless. The rats could not be meaningfully reduced. They reproduced faster than they could be killed, and the food supply was inexhaustible. The second adaptation was tolerance. Men ate alongside rats. Men slept alongside them. They learned to recognize the feeling of a rat moving across their legs in the night and to not react to it, because reacting to it meant waking up, and sleep was the scarcest resource in the trench system. The third adaptation, which was the most psychologically significant, was a form of dark domestication. Some men named individual rats. Some fed them from their rations. There are accounts of soldiers forming something like companionship with specific animals over extended tours in the same sector. This was not sentimentality. It was the human need for something living that was not trying to kill you. And in the trench environment, the options for such companionship were limited. The lice were different from the rats in that there was no distance between them and the men. The lice lived on the men. They lived in the seams of the clothing, in the hair, in the eyebrows. They were present in every unit, in every sector, in every national army on the Western Front, without exception, throughout the entire war. The British Army estimated that at any given time, the majority of its frontline soldiers were infested. The estimate was probably conservative. The discomfort they caused was significant and continuous, but it was the secondary effects that became most deeply integrated into trench routine. Lice are a vector for trench fever, a bacterial infection caused by Bartonella quintana, which produces a recurring high fever, severe bone pain, and debilitating headaches. Trench fever removed more men from the front line than any single category of wound except the most severe. It was not identified as a distinct disease until 1915, a full year into the war, and its cause was not definitively established until 1918. For most of the war, men suffering from it were told to return to duty when the fever subsided, which it would, and then return again when it recurred, which it also would, because the lice were still there. The delousing stations that were set up behind the lines became a standard feature of the rotation system. Men would be pulled from the front, stripped of their clothing, run through a heated chamber intended to kill the lice in the fabric, bathed and reissued clothing. The process worked briefly. The clothing was frequently reinfested within days of return to the line. Men developed the habit of running a candle flame along the seams of their shirts and trousers, a process called chatting in the British Army, an activity that could occupy an hour and would kill a portion of the population without eliminating the infestation. Men did this together, in groups, with the same social ease that they might have applied to any other shared domestic activity. The intimacy of shared delousing, sitting with another man and running a flame along his collar, became simply part of the texture of trench life, unremarkable, ordinary. The relationship with the dead was perhaps the most psychologically significant adaptation that trench warfare produced, and the one that was most systematically suppressed in the official accounts. In previous wars, in most of human military history, the dead were removed from the battlefield with reasonable promptness. This was not always possible in the most intense fighting, but it was the norm. The Western Front made it the exception. The nature of the defensive system, the continuous fire that swept no man's land during daylight hours, the physical impossibility in many sectors of recovering bodies without suffering additional casualties, and the sheer scale of the killing meant that bodies accumulated in and around the trench lines in quantities that the burial system could not manage. They were built into the trench walls. This is not a metaphor. When a trench was constructed or extended through an area where bodies lay, the bodies became structural elements. They were covered with sandbags and earth, incorporated into the revetment, present as objects beneath the surface that men leaned against and sat on. Over time, as the covering eroded, they became visible again. Men learned to identify the dead by smell before sight. There is a specific progression of decomposition odor that soldiers on the Western Front described, with a precision that reflects sustained exposure. The early stages were distinguished from the later stages. The presence of gas-inflated bodies was noted as distinct from the ordinary dead. The smell of the recently killed was categorized differently from the smell of those who had been in no man's land for weeks. This was not morbid interest. It was information. The smell told a man what he was approaching in the dark, told him whether the ground nearby had been recently disturbed by shelling, told him things about the state of his sector that visual inspection during daylight was too dangerous to provide. The senses adapted to gather information from stimuli that would, in any other context, produce immediate flight. Instead, they produced calibrated assessment. The dead became part of the navigational landscape. Eating in proximity to the dead became standard. There was no alternative. The trench line did not offer sanitary separation between the living quarters and the areas where bodies lay. Rations were consumed in dugouts that abutted, sometimes literally intersected with, spaces containing decomposing remains. The ability to eat in these conditions was not, for most men, an immediate capability. It was acquired. It took time. For some men it took weeks. For others it was faster. But it was acquired, because the alternative was not eating, and men who did not eat did not function, and men who did not function were a liability. So the body and the mind together negotiated the barrier between the smell and the food, and found a way across it. That crossing, once made, could not easily be unmade. Men who came home from the war and sat at family tables sometimes found that ordinary domestic meals triggered the memory of where they had eaten the same food 4 years earlier. They did not always explain this to the people sitting with them. Sleep was rationed, disrupted, and systematically degraded over the course of a soldier's time in the line. The watch rotation in most national armies required men to stand to at dawn and dusk, the periods of highest risk for assault, and to provide sentries throughout the night. In a typical British battalion, the practical effect was that most men in the forward trenches received between 2 and 4 hours of sleep in any 24-hour period. This was not occasional. It was the sustained condition of front-line service. Over weeks and months, the cumulative sleep deprivation produced effects that were sometimes difficult to distinguish from the early stages of what would now be recognized as psychosis. Men hallucinated. They reported conversations with absent people. They lost track of time in ways that went beyond ordinary confusion, losing not just the hour but the day, the week, sometimes the month. They fell asleep standing at their posts and were punished for it. Some were shot for it, under the regulations of multiple national armies, including the British, which executed soldiers for sleeping on sentry duty, which is to say, executed men for a physiological response to sustained sleep deprivation that no regulation could prevent. The adaptation to this condition produced one of the more remarkable behavioral patterns of the trench war, which was the ability to sleep in fragments, in positions, and in circumstances that would make rest impossible for anyone who had not been through the conditioning process. Men slept sitting upright in the fire step niche. They slept standing in communication trenches during movement. They slept in groups during artillery bombardment, not because the bombardment was not terrifying, but because the body's need for rest eventually outweighed the terror, and the terror itself became a kind of white noise, constant enough to no longer demand conscious attention. Heavy shelling over time became something men slept through. This was not bravery. It was exhaustion. It was the body's negotiation with a situation in which the conventional triggers for wakefulness, danger, noise, physical threat were permanently present and therefore could no longer serve their function. The food itself deserves extended consideration because the management of food in the trench system reveals with particular clarity the institutional logic that governed the entire war. The official ration for a British soldier in the field included a daily allowance of meat, bread or biscuit, tea, sugar, jam, and small quantities of other items. The official ration existed on paper. What arrived at the forward trenches was a reduced, degraded version of that ration, the reduction occurring at each stage of the distribution chain from the base depot to the front line, each stage introducing the possibility of loss, spoilage, theft, and administrative error, each of which occurred with regularity. The food that reached the men in the forward trenches had often traveled for 24 to 48 hours, carried in containers that were not sealed, through terrain that was under fire, by carrying parties that were themselves sometimes killed in transit. The bully beef, which was tinned corned beef and which formed the central protein element of the diet, was tolerable when it was the primary food available, and intolerable after extended periods when it was the only food available. Men ate it cold because heating it required a fire, and fires in the forward trenches were visible to enemy snipers. Hardtack biscuits, called various names by various national armies but sharing the characteristic of being essentially indestructible and essentially nutrition-free, supplemented the meat. Tea, when it was available, was important out of proportion to its nutritional content because it was hot, and because it was familiar, and because the act of making and drinking tea imposed a brief domestic ritual on an environment from which every other domestic reference had been removed. The British Army's tea supply was maintained with a seriousness that observers have sometimes found darkly comic in retrospect. Tea came forward even when other supplies did not. It was, in a sense, the most efficient morale tool the institution possessed, and the institution knew it. Alcohol was another managed resource, and its distribution and use became one of the more carefully calibrated rituals of the trench system. The British Army's standard provision of rum, issued before major operations and in cold weather, was not a generous allowance. It was a small amount, a tablespoon or two, consumed under the supervision of an officer from a regimental rum jar that was maintained in the officer's custody. The ceremony of the rum issue was as important as the rum itself. It was a moment of institutional acknowledgement that what the men were about to do, or had just done, or were surviving through, was worth a small material recognition. The rum, pharmacologically, had limited effect. Psychologically, it was a communication from the institution to the individual that said, in its limited way, we know. The men understood this. They valued the rum issue far beyond its alcohol content. Missing it was experienced as a significant deprivation, not because the men needed the alcohol in a physiological sense, but because missing it meant the acknowledgement did not come. French and German armies managed alcohol differently, with wine allocations in the French case and beer more common in the German, but the institutional function was similar. The British case is simply better documented. What is consistent across all armies is that alcohol use beyond the official allowance was pervasive, was known to the command structure, was intermittently punished, and was ultimately managed rather than suppressed, because suppression would have required enforcing sobriety on men whose continued cooperation with the institution depended on having some avenue of relief from the sustained conditions of the line. The officer corps in most armies consumed alcohol at rates that would, in any other employment context, have resulted in immediate dismissal. This was not secret. It was managed. The rituals around tobacco performed a similar function with even broader institutional support. Cigarettes were supplied as part of the official ration in most national armies. They were delivered in quantities that reflected an understanding of their importance to unit cohesion and individual functioning. Smoking in the forward trenches posed a risk from snipers who targeted the glow of a cigarette at night with documented effectiveness, but men smoked anyway, cupping the cigarette in the palm, lying in the trench bottom to reduce the silhouette, accepting the risk as preferable to the alternative of not smoking. The risk calculation here is interesting. A man who knew that a sniper was active in a given sector and who had watched another man shot for the same action would nonetheless smoke at night in a forward trench. This was not irrational. It was a prioritization of immediate psychological need over statistical risk. The cigarette was now. The sniper was probabilistic. The body, under sustained stress, is not well calibrated for long-term probabilistic reasoning. The cigarette won consistently. The psychological adaptation to artillery bombardment was one of the most significant and least publicly acknowledged processes of the entire war. The standard shell shock narrative, which entered the popular understanding of the conflict and has remained there in various forms, presents the condition as a response to a specific traumatic event, a near miss, a burial by explosion, a close-range death of a companion. This account is not wrong, but it is incomplete. It describes the acute presentations. The chronic presentations, which were numerically larger and institutionally more significant, developed differently. They developed through sustained exposure to a level of noise, concussive force, and physical threat that the human nervous system has no evolved mechanism for processing. The baseline artillery exchange on the Western Front, the routine daily fire that was not an offensive operation, not a major bombardment, but simply the ordinary background sound of the war, was louder than any noise that human beings had previously been subjected to on a sustained basis. Men in the forward trenches were within effective range of shell bursts that were not targeted at them specifically, but landed within distances that produced significant concussive pressure. Over months of exposure, the cumulative effect of this concussive pressure on the neurological system produced changes that were physiological rather than psychological in origin, though the distinction was not clearly understood at the time and is still contested. Men developed tremors. They developed stammers. They developed hearing loss that the army initially refused to formally recognize as a service-connected injury because formal recognition would have created a pension obligation at a scale that the Treasury could not manage. Men went deaf, partially selectively, in ways that did not always resolve after removal from the line. The army processed these cases through a system designed to minimize the pension burden. Men were assessed as having a pre-existing hearing weakness. They were assessed as having recovered to a threshold that the institutional threshold required them to have recovered to, regardless of their actual functional state. Shell shock as a diagnosis was institutionally inconvenient from the first moment it was applied. The initial British medical response was to attempt to make it disappear as a diagnosis by replacing it with administrative categories that implied less severe long-term impairment. Not yet diagnosed nervous, which appeared on the evacuation paperwork of men who were physically trembling and unable to form coherent speech, was one such category. The implication of the designation was that the nervous system would recover once removed from the cause, and that the cause was temporary exposure to abnormal stress rather than sustained fundamental damage. The category served the institution's need to keep the revolving door turning, to take men out of the line, stabilize them minimally, and return them. Many men went through this process multiple times. They were treated, returned, broken again, treated again, returned again. The army tracked this in some cases. In many cases it did not, because tracking it would have created a documentary record of institutional knowledge that the men being returned were likely to be broken again. The men who did not break in the officially recognized ways, who did not produce the visible trembling and the stammer and the inability to walk, developed their own quieter adaptations. One of the most pervasive was the systematic suspension of forward thinking. Men in the front line, over extended periods, stopped planning for the future, not in the casual sense of setting aside long-term ambitions, but in the fundamental sense of not constructing mental scenarios in which they survived. The planning horizon contracted. Tomorrow became uncertain. Next week was beyond reliable imagination. Home, for many men, had become a concept so distant from the present reality that contemplating it produced pain rather than comfort. And the mind, which is efficient in its management of pain, simply stopped going there. Men lived in an extended present. They thought about the next hour, the next meal, the next stand to. They did not think about what would happen when the war was over, because the possibility of the war being over was too abstract to be useful. This suspension of futurity had a secondary effect that was never formally recognized, but is documented in letters and diaries with a frequency that makes it unmistakable. Men who had contracted the habit of not thinking forward became, in a specific and limited sense, less afraid of dying. Not because they were brave or fatalistic in a philosophical sense, but because they had stopped inhabiting the future self, who would suffer the consequences of death. The future self did not exist as a vivid presence. Death remained horrible when it was close, when it was immediate, when it belonged to someone visible. But abstract death, the statistical likelihood of one's own death, had lost its grip. This was adaptive in the context of the trench. It allowed men to function in conditions where the rational response to the death risk would have been immediate paralysis. It was catastrophically maladaptive for the men who survived and had to rebuild a future self from nothing when the war ended, and found that the mechanism for doing so had atrophied beyond immediate use. The relationship between officers and men in the British and Commonwealth armies underwent a transformation under trench conditions that the institutional structure was not designed to accommodate, and that the official histories have consistently understated. The formal distance prescribed by military regulation and by the class assumptions of Edwardian Britain was incompatible with the physical reality of the trench environment. Officers and men ate in the same spaces. They were hit by the same shells. The officer who maintained formal distance in the forward trench was not respected. He was considered dangerous because formal distance in that context meant inattention to the men, and inattention to the men meant preventable deaths. The officers who survived and who were effective closed the distance. They learned the names of their men. They shared food. They made decisions that prioritized the welfare of the men over the letter of the regulations, which in the trench environment frequently meant the same thing as prioritizing their own survival, since officers and men were in the same shell crater. The result was a set of relationships that were in many cases more intimate than any the participants had experienced outside the war. Men who had no vocabulary for emotional intimacy, who came from cultures and class positions where emotional expression between men was not a normal feature of life, formed attachments to their officers and to each other that the existing social language was not adequate to describe. The letters that survive, particularly from men of lower social origin who did not have a literary tradition to draw on, attempt to describe these relationships and frequently fail to find the words, producing descriptions that circle around the attachment without landing on it. He was a good man. He was the best I ever knew. I would have done anything for him. These phrases appear in thousands of letters, written about officers, about fellow soldiers, about men who died in the same action. They are inadequate. They were the best available. The loss of these attachments, when it came, and it came for everyone who stayed long enough, was a specific kind of grief that the culture had no framework for processing. Men grieved dead officers with an intensity that their own families were not prepared to understand. They grieved dead companions with a completeness that went beyond anything their civilian experience had prepared them for. And then, because the war did not stop to accommodate grief, they buried it. They buried it in the same way they buried everything else that could not be permitted to be a functional disability, with a deliberate, practiced suppression that became its own habit. The habit of not grieving in the immediate aftermath of loss, of filing it, setting it aside, continuing to function, was essential to survival. It was also, for the men who came home, a gift that kept producing consequences for decades. The grief that had been suppressed did not decompose. It remained in the same preserved condition as the bodies built into the trench walls, covered but present, detectable eventually by those who knew the smell. Soldiers developed what could only be described as an expert knowledge of mortality. They learned to read the sound of incoming shells, to distinguish by the acoustic signature of the incoming round whether it was going to land close, whether it was going to land very close, whether there was anything to be done about it, or whether the only appropriate response was to be very flat and very still and to wait. A shell that was going to land far away made one sound. A shell that was going to land close made a different sound. A shell that was going to land in your immediate position made a sound that men described in the same terms, regardless of nationality. A rushing acceleration that shortened into a scream, and then there was either the explosion or there was not. The men who survived long enough became proficient at this discrimination. They could estimate distance. They could estimate size. They could tell artillery from mortar, and mortar from rifle grenade, and rifle grenade from sniper fire. They could do this while asleep, waking only when the assessment of the incoming sound reached a threshold that required action. This acoustic calibration was not taught. It was acquired through exposure and through the selection pressure of the trench environment in which the men who could not learn it tended not to survive long enough to pass it on. The men who could learn it survived longer, on average, though long enough in this context is a relative term. The expertise was extensive, detailed, and genuinely impressive as a human achievement. It was also completely useless outside the trench. Men came home with this finely calibrated internal instrument for assessing incoming ordnance and no environment in which to use it. The sound of a car backfiring was processed by the same system that had once assessed shell trajectories, and the system responded appropriately to its own training, which was to assume that the sound required immediate evasive action. This was not a symptom. It was a skill. It was a skill that had nowhere to go. The killing itself, the direct act of taking the life of another person, was handled by the institutional structure with a deliberate obscurity that served a specific psychological purpose. The artillery, which was responsible for the large majority of battlefield deaths on the Western Front, removed the killer from direct perception of the killed. A man at a field gun, or at the larger pieces further behind the line, could maintain a functional separation between the act of firing the weapon and the effect of the projectile. The shell traveled. It arrived somewhere. What it did there was information that came back through reports, through casualty figures, through the abstract language of military accounting. The gunner was not there for it. This was not accidental. The professionalization of distance killing was one of the adaptations that made industrial warfare possible, because the psychological cost of direct killing at scale would have been immediately incapacitating in ways that the system could not manage. For the men who did kill directly, in trench raids, in the brief and savage close-quarters combat that occurred when a raiding party entered the enemy trench, the psychological processing was different. Trench raids were a regular feature of the war in all sectors, organized by the command structure as a means of maintaining aggressive spirit, gathering intelligence on enemy dispositions, and demonstrating to the higher command that the front was active and that the expenditure of men and material was producing results. The men who conducted them understood them in different terms. A trench raid required a small group, typically 8 to 30 men, to cross no man's land at night, enter the enemy trench, kill or capture its occupants, and withdraw. The killing in this context was done at arm's length, with bayonet, entrenching tool, club, knife or bare hands, because firearms could not be reliably silenced, and the sound of shooting would bring the enemy response that the raid was designed to avoid. The men who did this returned to their own lines afterward, and were required to report, be debriefed, possibly be commended, eat their rations, attempt to sleep, and present themselves at the next stand too. There was no mechanism for processing what they had done. There was no acknowledgement in the institutional structure that what they had done was different in kind from other military duties. The kills counted in the same column as kills by any other method. The paperwork did not distinguish. The men who had done it understood that it was different. They had a specific knowledge of another person's dying that the gunner did not have. They carried it. They did not, in most cases, describe it. The letters and the diaries that have survived from men who participated in trench raids are notable for the frequency with which they mention the raid and then describe something else entirely, moving to food or weather, or a conversation overheard. The writing making the turn that the mind had also made, which was away from the thing that could not be said. The practice of taking trophies from the enemy dead was widespread enough to constitute a routine, was officially prohibited by military regulations in most armies, and was officially ignored in practice in most armies. The items taken were various: uniform insignia, identity discs, personal letters, photographs, pocket watches, rings. The motivation was also various. Some men took trophies as evidence of their activity in the same way that a hunter keeps evidence of kills. Some took them as a primitive attempt to assert some form of permanent record of an encounter that the war's own administrative system was designed to make anonymous. Some took them because they represented, however perversely, a form of contact with the human reality of the enemy. The small domestic details that reminded them, in a way that military categorization did not, that the men they were killing were also carrying photographs and letters. The German helmet that ended up on a mantelpiece in a Sheffield house was, in a sense, evidence against the war's preferred self-presentation, which was a contest between categories rather than between people. The trophy said, "This was a specific man. He wore this thing. I took it from him when I killed him." The war did not want that level of specificity. The war wanted numbers and objectives and percentages of territorial gain. The trophy was a refusal of that abstraction, however unconscious and however dark. The sentry duty that occupied so many hours of the trench soldier's service was a practice that produced its own distinctive psychological pressures. A sentry stood at the fire step, his eyes above the parapet level in darkness, looking into no man's land for movement that might indicate an enemy patrol or a dawn attack. He did this for 2-hour intervals in most rotation systems before being relieved. The darkness of no man's land was not uniform. It was populated by shapes, by the irregular terrain of shell craters and abandoned equipment, and the obscured forms of the unrecovered dead, by wire that caught the light in unexpected ways, by the movement of the wind through grass and debris. After a period of time, all of this material became animated by the exhausted and stressed mind of the sentry. Men saw things that were not there. They saw movement where there was none. They saw figures that turned out to be fence posts, bodies that turned out to be discarded equipment, enemies that turned out to be the imagination-producing threat. out of insufficient data. The appropriate response to a sighting was to fire. The consequence of firing on a false alarm was to alert the enemy that the sector was awake and active, and possibly to draw return fire. The consequence of not firing on a real sighting was potentially catastrophic. The sentry was therefore in a constant state of assessment, holding the response ready, evaluating the information against the known properties of the terrain, attempting to distinguish the real from the produced, in the dark, while exhausted, while cold, while aware that a mistake in either direction could kill people he was responsible for. Men who did this for weeks and months developed a hair-trigger assessment system that was highly accurate within its designed environment and highly disruptive outside it. They were extraordinarily alert to threat. They processed ambiguous information toward the worst interpretation. This was appropriate to the trench. It was not appropriate to a bus journey in Birmingham, and the bus journey in Birmingham came eventually for those who came home. The medical system of the Western Front was one of the largest and most complex administrative structures ever assembled in support of a military operation, and it was routinely overwhelmed. The volume of casualties that the industrial war produced exceeded the capacity of any system designed in advance to handle it. The casualty clearing stations, which sat behind the immediate forward areas and ahead of the base hospitals, became during major offensives processing centers for human damage at a scale that required the medical staff to make triage decisions that civilian medical ethics did not have a framework for. Men were sorted into three categories: those who could be treated quickly and returned to duty, those who needed more extensive treatment and would be evacuated, and those whose injuries were too severe to warrant the investment of time and resources in treatment. The third category was given morphine and moved to the side. They were made comfortable in the available sense of the word, and they were set aside. The nurses and doctors and orderlies who made these decisions, who worked for shifts that extended to 20 and 30 hours during major offensives, who operated under conditions of continuous noise and inadequate light and insufficient supplies, developed their own version of the trench soldier's adaptation. They suspended feeling in the moment of function. They maintained the capacity to feel and then filed it for later. The filing system, as with the soldiers, became permanent in many cases. Nurses who served through the Somme or Passchendaele came home to civilian nursing and found that the clinical distance they had developed was not something they could selectively deploy. It was, by the end, simply how they related to patients. The distance that had been a professional survival mechanism had become the professional manner itself. The letter writing that soldiers engaged in was a more complex act than its surface simplicity suggested. Every letter sent from the front was potentially subject to censorship, a reality of which all soldiers were aware, and which shaped the content of what was written in ways that the censors understood and depended on. The official censorship targeted military information, references to unit positions, casualty figures, planned operations, identifications of specific locations. But the soldiers who had been in the system for any length of time understood that the censorship also had an unofficial dimension, that letters which described the actual conditions of the front in too much detail were less likely to complete their journey, and that the families receiving letters had their own version of the same understanding, that the letter they received was a negotiated document rather than a direct communication. The result was a highly developed form of indirect speech. Men wrote around the things they wanted to say. They used established private codes with family members, agreed before deployment, that allowed the encoding of information that the censor would not recognize as significant. They used the language of physical state as a proxy for psychological state. "I am well" became a sentence that carried an enormous range of actual meaning, depending on the context in which it was received by a family member who knew what the conditions of the front were from the newspapers and the other letters arriving in the same street. The convention that letters should be positive, should reassure, should not add to the worry of those at home, was genuine in its motivation and genuinely toxic in its effect, because it maintained a fiction of comprehensibility that made the gap between the front experience and the home experience impossible to bridge when the men returned. The letters had said everything was manageable. The men came back and were not managing. The letters had not prepared the family for this because the letters had been written specifically to prevent that preparation. The burial of the dead, when it was possible, was conducted with a brevity and informality that would have been considered scandalous in any peacetime context. A chaplain, when available. A few words, when time allowed. A cross made from ration boxes, when material was at hand. An entry in the unit war diary, when someone had the time and the information to make it. Frequently, none of these things occurred in combination. Men were buried by the men who had served with them in whatever ground was available, with whatever markers could be improvised, and the location was recorded with whatever precision the circumstances permitted, which was frequently insufficient to allow the grave to be found after the war. The Imperial War Graves Commission, which was established during the war to manage the burial problem at scale, ultimately acknowledged that a substantial proportion of the British and Commonwealth dead could not be individually identified. The phrase "known unto God," which appears on the graves of unidentified soldiers across the Western Front today, is one of the most honest sentences the British state produced in connection with the war. It is an acknowledgement that the state's tracking system had failed at the most basic level, which was knowing which man was where. The enemy dead were handled with less ceremony and less consistency. They were buried when they were in the way and left when they were not. Men who had fought against specific German units developed, in some sectors and over extended periods, a relationship with the German dead that was qualitatively different from their relationship with the British dead, not because they felt more for them, but because they had been living near them for longer without the intrusion of the living versions. There is a particularly well-documented phenomenon from several sectors of the Western Front in which soldiers from both sides developed informal arrangements that permitted the recovery of wounded and dead from no man's land without triggering a resumption of fire. These arrangements were entirely unauthorized. They violated the orders of both command structures. They occurred because the men on both sides of the wire recognized a practical utility in them that the command structure's insistence on continuous aggression did not serve. The wounded needed to be recovered. The dead needed to be off the field before the smell became additional psychological burden. Both sides benefited. The arrangement was maintained until it was discovered by the command structure, at which point it was ended, and the usual conditions resumed. The Christmas truce of 1914 is the most famous instance of this dynamic and the most thoroughly romanticized. Its essential character, that men who had been trying to kill each other agreed, briefly and without authorization, to stop, is treated in the popular account as evidence of some fundamental human decency breaking through the machinery of war. The more accurate reading is that it represented a systemic failure of the institutional logic of the war, which required continuous enmity as its operational premise, and that the command structure on both sides recognized it as such and moved to prevent its recurrence. It did not recur at the same scale. Not because the men on the line stopped wanting it to, but because the institutional infrastructure of control was strengthened in response to it, and because the war by 1915 had produced enough mutual atrocity to make the spontaneous cessation of hostilities harder to initiate. The machinery corrected for the human moment. It was better than the human moment at self-perpetuation. The mental arithmetic of survival that frontline soldiers engaged in was not random or irrational. It was a systematic attempt to use the information available to calculate the probability of death or wounding in a given action, and to use that calculation in the management of fear. Men tracked the attrition of their units. They tracked the patterns of officer loss, since officers attracted fire from enemy snipers and frequently led from positions of greater exposure. They tracked the patterns of specialist losses, since machine gunners and signalers and stretcher-bearers occupied roles that the enemy actively targeted. They tracked the patterns of attack and sector rotation, since some sectors were genuinely quieter than others, and some types of offensive operation had significantly higher casualty rates than others. This information was not officially provided. It was accumulated through observation, and through the informal network of communication between men who had been in different sectors and different units, the network of gossip and report that the official communication systems did not carry, but that was, in many respects, more accurate. From this accumulated information, men constructed probability estimates for their own survival. The estimates were generally pessimistic, which was appropriate to the data. Men who believed they were going to die had, in many cases, made a rational assessment. The problem with the estimate was not its accuracy, but its effect. A man who believed with reasonable confidence that he was going to die had two operational options. The first was to attempt to avoid dying, to find ways to minimize exposure, to exploit the flexibility of the trench system in ways that reduced risk. The second was to accept the probability, and to find within that acceptance a form of freedom, since a man who had accepted death was no longer expending energy on the project of avoiding it and could redirect that energy entirely into the present moment. Both options were exercised. Both had costs. The first produced a kind of ongoing, low-intensity dread that was manageable in small doses and psychologically devastating over extended periods. The second produced a quality of engagement with immediate experience that men who came home sometimes described in retrospect as the most intensely alive they had ever felt, which is a deeply uncomfortable thing to say about a context in which the intensity was produced by the proximity of mass death. The relationship between the men at the front and the men directing the war from positions of greater physical safety was one of the formative social tensions of the period, and one that was most carefully managed in the official historical accounts. The British Army's General Staff, the high command that made the operational decisions, was based at Montreuil for most of the war, which was far enough behind the front that its occupants did not experience shell fire as a regular feature of their working environment. The decisions made there resulted in casualty figures that were compiled into reports and distributed upward through the command hierarchy in the numerical form that the institutional structure required. A senior officer reviewing the daily casualty report from a major offensive was reading numbers. The numbers were accurate. They did not convey what the numbers represented. The men who generated the numbers had a specific and accumulated contempt for the men who compiled them that was one of the most carefully suppressed elements of the front soldiers' experience. It was expressed in private and indirect ways, in the nickname brass hats applied to staff officers with a flatness of affect that was more withering than any explicit insult, in the observation that the staff officers' uniforms were clean, in the specific anger that arose when a staff officer was encountered in the forward areas and his physical discomfort was visible to men who had been in those forward areas for weeks. The anger was not always suppressed. There were incidents of frontline soldiers failing to salute officers they considered responsible for unnecessary casualties, failing to perform the evasive deference that military regulation required, making their assessment visible in a glance or a tone that technically did not constitute insubordination but was understood by everyone present as being in the same territory. The military justice system of the First World War is a subject that the official histories of most national armies engaged in the conflict handled with extraordinary care, which is to say that they handled it in ways designed to minimize the documentary record of its most troubling aspects. The British Army executed 306 of its own soldiers during the war. The categories for which the death penalty was applied included desertion, cowardice, falling asleep at post, striking a superior officer, and murder. The distribution of these executions was not random. Men from lower social classes were disproportionately represented. Men who had been in the line longer without rotation were disproportionately represented. Men whose defense at court-martial had been inadequate or non-existent were disproportionately represented, and in many cases their defense had been inadequate because they had not been provided with the summary nature of field courts-martial in some periods of the war being incompatible with any serious defense of the accused. The men who were executed were, in a number of documented cases, men who were exhibiting clear symptoms of the neurological and psychological damage that sustained frontline service produced. They were men who had broken under conditions that the Army's own medical service acknowledged in other contexts were capable of breaking men. They were shot anyway, because the institution required that the penalty be applied to maintain the operational premise that men could be required to function under those conditions indefinitely, and that failure to function was a moral failure rather than a physiological one. The families of these men were not told the circumstances of their deaths. The Army informed the next of kin that the man had died on active service. The pension was not paid, because the death had occurred as a result of a sentence rather than enemy action. The families sometimes found out years later. Some families never found out. The medical treatment of psychological casualties underwent a significant evolution over the course of the war, but the evolution was driven by institutional need rather than by humanitarian concern. And this distinction is important. The initial response to what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder was to deny its existence as a medical category and to process affected men through the disciplinary system. The second response, which developed as the scale of the psychological casualty rate made the disciplinary response operationally unsustainable, was to create a medical category that implied temporary dysfunction and certain recovery, so that the men could be treated and returned to the line. The third response, which developed toward the end of the war and in the immediate post-war period, was to begin to acknowledge that some of the damage was permanent, but to frame this acknowledgement in terms that minimized the state's financial obligation to the damaged men. The pension assessment system for shell shock and related conditions after the war was a masterpiece of institutional management. Men were assessed by boards that operated on criteria designed to produce the lowest possible level of disability recognition. The standard required for recognition was not what the man could not do, but what he could do, and the definition of what constituted sufficient functional capacity was adjusted in ways that reflected the Treasury's interest rather than the medical evidence. Men who could dress themselves and move between rooms and perform basic domestic functions were assessed as not significantly disabled, regardless of their inability to leave the house, maintain employment, sustain relationships, or sleep without the contents of the war replaying through their nervous systems. The paperwork said they had recovered. The paperwork was what the institution needed the paperwork to say. The men who came home and could not reintegrate entered a social environment that had been shaped by 4 years of official narrative management into a state of profound incomprehension regarding what the war had actually been. The people at home had been told about the gallant boys and the noble sacrifice and the necessity of the struggle. They had not been told about the rats and the mud and the executed soldiers and the 3-hour sleep cycles and the eating among the dead and the complete suspension of any sense of a future self. The gap between what the men knew and what the people at home had been told was so wide that many men simply chose never to cross it. They came home. They did not speak about it. They carried the contents of the trench in complete interior solitude for the rest of their lives, and when they died, the specifics of what they had lived through died with them. This silence was sometimes presented as stoicism, and sometimes as dignity, and sometimes as the natural reticence of men of a certain generation and a certain social class. It was partly those things. It was also the only rational response to a situation in which speaking would have required explaining something that the listener had not been prepared to hear. It would have required the speaker to find words for experiences that had exceeded the capacity of the existing vocabulary, and to find a listener who had the frame of reference to receive those words without either dismissing them or being destroyed by them. Most men could not find such a listener. The men who had been there were the only ones with the frame of reference, and the convention among them was silence, because silence was what they had all agreed on as the appropriate response to what they shared. The gas attacks of the Western Front introduced a form of killing that had not existed before and that produced its own specific adaptations. Chemical weapons were used by both sides from 1915 onward, with various agents deployed at various stages of the war, from the chlorine of the first major gas attack at Ypres in April 1915 through the mustard gas that became the predominant agent by 1917. The gas mask was issued as a countermeasure, but the mask was only effective if it was applied before the agent reached the concentration at which it caused damage, and the warning systems were imperfect. The bell that was rung when gas was detected, the horn that was sounded, the klaxon that was installed in some sectors, all required someone to detect the gas before it spread, which in the early moments of an attack was not always possible. Men who were asleep when the gas came, men in sectors where the wind shifted unexpectedly, men whose masks had been damaged or were poorly fitted, received doses that were not immediately fatal, but that produced damage to the pulmonary tissue, the corneas, the skin, that was permanent. The adaptation to the gas threat produced one of the most distinctive behaviors of the trench soldier, which was the continuous low-level vigilance for smell. Men learned to identify gas agents by their odor, which the agents frequently had, the smell of chlorine being well known before the war, the phosgene having a smell of fresh hay, the mustard gas having the odor that gave it its name. They learned to identify the direction from which a faint smell was coming, learned to distinguish an artillery round that had burst upwind from one that had burst downwind, learned to read the wind before dawn when gas attacks were most commonly initiated, because the cooler air of the early morning held the heavier-than-air gases close to the ground where the men in the trenches lay. This olfactory vigilance was continuous. It operated while the men were engaged in other activities, in conversation, in eating, in sleep, where it was not entirely suppressible. It was a background process of the adapted nervous system, and like the acoustic calibration for incoming shells, it was a skill that had no application outside the environment that produced it. The stretcher bearers occupied a role in the trench system that combined the highest levels of physical risk with the lowest levels of formal recognition, a combination that reflects with particular clarity the institutional logic of the war. Stretcher bearers moved through ground that was under fire to reach men who were wounded and could not move, attached the men to stretchers, and carried them back through the same ground to the first aid point. They did this without weapons, since their role was explicitly non-combatant, which meant that they could not return fire if fired upon, which they were regularly and with documented deliberateness in some sectors where the opposing force did not observe the conventions of the Geneva Convention regarding medical personnel. They worked in units of 4, since a stretcher carrying an average adult man required 4 men to carry efficiently over broken ground. They were required to carry men from locations that could be at considerable distance from the aid point, over ground that included the lip of shell craters, through gaps in wire, along communication trenches that were themselves under sporadic fire. The casualty rate among stretcher bearers was high. Their willingness to continue performing the function under those conditions was one of the things that the men who were carried by them remembered and, in the letters and memoirs, tried to find words for. The stretcher bearer was the first human presence after a wound, the face that arrived when everything had been uncertain, the hands that managed the movement from the place where the wound had happened to the place where someone would try to address it. The gratitude was not always reciprocated in institutional terms. Stretcher bearers received their standard pay. Their casualties were compiled in the same columns as everyone else's. The function was necessary and therefore it was performed, and the men who performed it were replaced when they became unavailable, as they regularly did. The chaplains of the various armies served a role that was psychologically important in ways that were sometimes disconnected from the specifically theological content of their function. Many men, who had no particular religious belief, found comfort in the presence of a chaplain. Not because the chaplain's message was persuasive, but because the chaplain represented in some minimal way an institutional acknowledgement that the death of an individual mattered beyond its operational significance. The burial service, conducted in whatever abbreviated form the circumstances permitted, said that this man was a person rather than a statistic. The men who witnessed it knew that the service was brief, that the grave might not be recoverable, that the system that the chaplain represented was the same system that had sent the man into the situation that required the service. They found comfort in it anyway, which says something about the human need for ritual acknowledgement that no institutional critique adequately addresses. Some chaplains served in the forward areas, close enough to the front line to be present when men died and to conduct the burial in immediate proximity to the action. These men were often held in very high regard by the soldiers, with a specific admiration that was distinct from religious feeling and that was based on the simple observation that the chaplain had no reason to be there, unlike the soldier who had been ordered to be there and had come anyway. The courage this represented was not military courage in the operational sense, not the courage of the assault, but a quieter form. The willingness to be in a place of extreme danger without the organizational structure of combat, to channel the experience into something purposeful. The chaplain stood by a grave in the open ground and spoke the words, and had no gun and no orders that justified the risk, and did it anyway. Men noticed this. Men who had been told all their lives that courage was about going over the top recognized a different kind when they saw it. The food and water supply chains of the trench system were a constant source of breakdown, and the adaptations that men developed in response to supply failure were, in retrospect, among the most striking indicators of the degree to which the men had internalized the logic of the institution they served. When rations did not arrive, men did not riot. They did not refuse to serve. They complained within the permitted forms of complaint, which were considerable in the British Army and somewhat less so in the French and German armies. They improvised from what was available, and they continued to function. The capacity for this improvisation under the worst supply conditions was extraordinary. Men trapped in forward positions during prolonged bombardment, cut off from any resupply, ate emergency rations that were designed to sustain life for 48 hours and made them sustain life for several days. They rationed water in circumstances where the available water was contaminated and the risk of cholera and typhoid from unboiled sources was real. They maintained operational capacity on inadequate fuel because the alternative was not doing so, and not doing so was not recognized as an option within the institutional framework they had internalized. This capacity for endurance under supply failure was not a natural human attribute. It was created. It was created by a training process that emphasized the subordination of individual need to collective function, by a regimental culture that made complaint in the wrong direction a social failure rather than just a regulation violation, and by the accumulated evidence that men who broke under supply failure died faster than men who did not, since a unit that was not functioning was a unit that attracted worse attention from the enemy. The endurance was rational within the parameters of the system. The parameters of the system were not rational in any larger sense, but the men inside it could not step outside it, and the training that had created the endurance had also created the difficulty of stepping outside. The relationship between the British and French armies on the Western Front, and between each of those armies and the various national contingents that fought alongside them, was managed at the command level, with a diplomacy that frequently failed at the level of the trench. Men from different national traditions found themselves sharing sector boundaries, sharing communication trenches, occasionally sharing dugouts, with men from countries that were their allies in the current conflict and had been, in some cases, their enemies in the previous generation. The British regular army soldier of 1914, the small professional force that was largely destroyed in the first year of the war, had a specific relationship with France and Frenchmen that was the product of centuries of prior conflict and a more recent decade of diplomatic entente. And that mixture produced a manner toward the French that was frequently described by French observers as insufferable and by British observers as perfectly ordinary. The mass armies that replaced the regulars were less burdened by institutional tradition and more directly reactive to the immediate experience. The French soldier of 1916, who had been through Verdun, had a relationship with the war and with his allies that was shaped by that experience in ways that were difficult to communicate across the language barrier to a British soldier who had not been at Verdun. The French mutinies of 1917, which followed the failure of the Nivelle offensive and which involved approximately half the divisions of the French army refusing to participate in further offensive operations, were the most dramatic institutional expression of this accumulated experience. They were managed with a combination of limited punishment and genuine improvement in conditions, an approach that the command structure adopted only when it was made clear that the alternative was the complete collapse of the front, and they were suppressed from public knowledge for decades afterward because the implications of what they meant about the front soldiers' experience were too significant to be permitted into the official account. The German army on the other side of the wire was, in the experience of the men who fought against it, a more ambiguous presence than the official narrative required it to be. The German soldier was the enemy. He was the legitimate target. He was the object against which all the industrial machinery of the Western Front was directed. He was also, in many sectors, the man with whom an informal understanding had been developed over weeks and months of facing each other across the same 200 yards of broken ground, an understanding that was entirely unofficial and entirely practical, and that covered things like the acceptable firing times for latrines, the identification of gaps in wire that allowed wounded recovery without triggering a general response, the direction of mortar fire that communicated aim off rather than intent to kill to the occupants of a known position. These understandings were not universal. They were not permanent. They were terminated by offensive operations, by the arrival of new units, by the orders of a command structure that identified them as incompatible with the institutional logic of the war and moved to break them. But they existed in more sectors and for more periods than the official histories acknowledged, because they were useful to both sides in the quiet management of the endless machinery of the trench, and because the men who had been facing each other for long enough had arrived, through accumulated mutual experience, at a practical understanding of each other as men rather than as categories. The rotation system that moved men from the forward trench to the support line to the reserve and then to rest billets behind the front was one of the key mechanisms through which the institution managed the human material of the war. The rest period was not, for most men, particularly restful. It involved fatigue duty, drilling, inspections, training for future operations, and the administrative tasks of the unit. It was, however, different from the forward trench in ways that the body and the mind registered and responded to. The absence of continuous threat, the relative possibility of sleep for longer consecutive periods, the presence of dry ground and buildings and occasionally food that was not bully beef, these things had a restorative effect that was real but incomplete. Men returned to the line after rest periods that had not fully undone the damage of the previous stint. They returned slightly better than they had left, but each cycle returned them slightly worse than the previous cycle because the cumulative damage was not fully addressed by the rest available, and the differential between damage and repair widened over time. The men who identified this process and attempted to act on it were in a difficult position. There was no legitimate route within the institutional structure for a man to say that he was too damaged to continue serving. The medical system provided routes for physical injury. The disciplinary system provided routes for the end of service through court-martial and imprisonment. There was no route for the man who was functioning within the required parameters, but who knew, with a certainty based on his own assessment of his deteriorating capacity, that he was approaching a point at which he would not be able to continue functioning. The institution had no category for preventive treatment of cumulative damage. It had categories for the management of acute breakdown after the fact. The consequence was that men served beyond the point of safe function because the system had no mechanism for identifying that point in advance. They served until they broke, and then they were processed through the category that their breaking most closely resembled, and then they were returned or they were not returned, depending on whether the category allowed for return. The most severely damaged were kept from the line. The men whose damage fell into the grey area, which was the large majority, were returned, and the cycle continued, and the numbers were maintained. The war ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. The armistice that ended the fighting was signed at 5 in the morning and went into effect at 11. The 6 hours between the signing and the effect cost approximately 11,000 casualties on both sides, approximately the same number as the average day on the Western Front in the years of the war. The operations that produced these casualties were ordered by commanders who knew the armistice had been signed and who continued to advance their units toward objectives that would have no operational significance 6 hours later. The reasons for this are various and contested. The result is not contested. Men died between 5 and 11 on the morning of November 11th, 1918, under orders from commanders who had the information that would have prevented those orders. The guns stopped at 11. The silence, which the men who heard it described in terms that suggest the word silence was inadequate for the experience, lasted. And then the men who were still in the trenches at 11 o'clock on November 11th, 1918, began the process of being demobilized and returning home and finding out what they were now and what they knew and what the country they were returning to had been told about what they had done and what had been done to them. And the country had been told a version that served the purposes of the country. And the men came home with the other version. And the distance between the two versions was the Western Front, which did not close when the guns stopped, and which does not close. The pension records of the British Ministry of Pensions show that as late as 1929, 11 years after the armistice, there were still over 300,000 men receiving disability payments related to the First World War. The neurological cases, the men whose damage was classified under the various administrative categories that had been developed to avoid the term shell shock, were still being assessed, reassessed, reduced, and in some cases terminated on administrative grounds. The war had produced a human liability at a scale that the administrative system of the post-war state was not prepared for and was not willing to fully acknowledge. And the management of that liability proceeded on the same principles that had governed the management of the men in the trenches, which was to minimize the cost to the institution while maintaining the appearance of meeting the obligation. The last veteran of the First World War's Western Front died in the first decade of the 21st century. The specific knowledge of what it had been to live inside the trench system, to acquire its habits, to become adapted to its conditions, to be changed by it in the ways that it changed the men who passed through it, that specific and irreplaceable knowledge died with them. What remains is the administrative record, which is extensive and carefully organized and systematically incomplete in the ways that administrative records of industrial killing are always systematically incomplete, and the partial testimony of the men who tried to describe it, and the graves, which are maintained with great precision by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, which knows exactly where the identified men are buried and which has marked the places where the unidentified men were, buried with the information that it is the only accurate information available, which is that they are known unto God, and that no further locating information is held.